Hello painting students. So the main portion of this particular video is going to be to start on the second layer, some more of the detail layers of the actual rooster himself. So as usual, I'm going to start with whatever is furthest back. So I'm going to be starting with the feather area that sort of is like in the place of his flesh, so to speak. So it is the furthest back portion of the bird himself. And I'm going to go ahead and start down here, similarly to how I did with my first layer, but now I'm going to have some of those feathers retain a little bit more of their texture. So I'm going to go back in with a bit of a brownish, grayish color there, because once again I am going to start in the areas where it is the darkest, and then work my way into the areas where it gets lighter. But this time, like I said, I'm going to leave more of the texture showing. I've got a smaller brush, a little less water. And I'm just going to be looking at my reference image a lot at this point. Really working on getting some of those textured parts in there. Still not complete detail yet, because it will still take a couple more layers to really get this finished up. But I'm basically just sort of making marks with my paintbrush and letting those marks show, letting them stay there. Once again, if I have an area where I want it to be white, I'm going to leave it white. I'm not going to put anything in that area. And I'm just looking for where those shadows are on this particular example. And the direction that my brush moves is basically determined by where the darkest part of that feather is. So I'm going to be pressing down in the darkest part of that feather and then lifting up as I get more towards the lighter value. I'm going to put a little brown in here on the outside, because that's what I'm seeing on my reference image. And these feathers kind of have more of a shadow underneath them, so I'm putting that darker value on the bottom and lifting up, because this section in here is kind of the lightest part of this particular part of his body. And remember, if I make any area lighter than or darker than I want to, I can always go back in and I can lift out some of that value. So I'm not too concerned about making something a little bit darker than it needs to be at this point. So that might be sort of the second layer on this portion of his body. Still not finished. I would want to let it dry a little bit more before working back into it, simply because if I work too much into the same area while it is still wet, it's not going to get any darker. It's just going to continue to blend more. And if I want to make sure that those feathers stay as separate feathers, the best thing to do is let it dry between layers. So now I'm just going to move on to the other side here, very much the same way. And there's a little more of the brown color down here, so I'm going to put some brown in there. Still have some of my blackish gray color mixed with it though. And again, just constantly looking at my reference image here. So for those of you whose animals have feathers like this one, or fur, this is basically the technique that you would want to use for feathers, for hair, for fur. You would want to make sure you pay attention to where the values are, what those values are as well. Because remember, shading is relative. And you would just sort of give the idea of the feather, the hair, or the fur. You are not going to do every single individual one, but you are going to kind of get the idea of the texture across. And remember that the further away something is, so the further away part of that animal is, the less detail it's going to have. So basically, the further away something is, the less texture you'll see. So keep that in mind as you are working as well. So one thing I'm going to do in this section is actually go in with the green that is similar to the green in my background and put a little bit of that in here, because what that's going to do is push this section back a little bit, because it's going to blend into that background some. It won't blend a lot because my background is pretty dry. But then as I use water, I can sort of soften that transition there. So right now I'm just using some water to sort of fade the turkey's body into the background that is directly behind it. So that is another example of working sort of back and forth between the foreground and the background. As I said, you will definitely find yourself needing to do that. So like here, for instance, same thing. Because a little bit of the green is not where it needs to be. There just isn't green there. I'm just going to go ahead and put some green there. And then I'm going to still fade it out so that it doesn't look quite as obvious there. And I am still not necessarily even done with my back and forth sort of there. But just so you know, that is sort of what you would do. How that happens. So I'm going to add some more feathers in here. Remembering to make sure that if I have white in there, I'm just leaving it white. Now I can still go back over that with a colored pencil if I need to get some more of that feathery texture in there. And on something like this guy, I probably would do that, simply because there's not much white. It's more or less sort of almost white, sort of creamy. So in order to be able to get that color more accurate, I can use a colored pencil on top of the watercolor paint. So now I'm going to go ahead and move up into the area where his face is, doing very much the same thing, not using a lot of red yet, even though there will be red, simply because I'm going to do the part that's behind the red first. And I'm just going to kind of dab it on there, let it stay textured. Dry off your brush if you need, because that can definitely help you create more of that texture while it fades into the color that's under it. So as you can see now, when I go back in with the drier brush, some of the color that's under it comes back up. And then lifting would work the same. So if I wanted to put some of my water here, make this whole area a little bit lighter, get some water there, press down with a paper towel, and then I've got an area that's lighter, still has some of that texture, but now matches my reference image a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and move up here. Working on the part of the feather that goes behind his little red thing. Not too worried about if I paint on top of the red thing at this point, because I know that I'll be painting red directly on top of that. But once again, making sure that if I have white, I leave it white there. So my white is more like right in here. That's the closest it gets to white. So I'm going to make sure that I leave that area lighter. So it's a little like scribbling with the paintbrush to leave some of that texture there. Once again, the biggest thing is just going to be looking for where your values are, where the shadows are, where the highlights are, so on and so forth. So now I'm going to go ahead and go in with some red and do something very similar to what I've just been doing, but now it's going to be some red and brown mixed. Sort of around his eyelid in here. Still letting the texture come. Still leaving the white areas white. Now I'm going to go ahead and start putting some of that darker value in here that creates his eyelid a little bit. Not all of it yet, but just starting to indicate where that will be. Because that is technically part of the feather aspect. So there's a lot more brown in the red on his face, but then the red up here and down here is red. So I want to make sure that I get that difference in there. That's a section of the red that goes behind his beak. So that would be sort of my second layer in terms of the feathers on this part of the face and body. So I would then do this part as well, which is all going to be a little bit lighter because of where my light source is. And then once I have a second layer on the feathers, I can then move into a second layer on the black portion, or the white portions with more black. That's where my brain was going with that. And I can move into a second layer on the red area, and then a second layer on the beak and the eyes. So I would still do each layer in the same order as I was doing the previous layers, so that I am still working from the back to the front.